Good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our fifth installment in our online Intersections of Gender in Conversation series. I'm Susanne Luhmann, and I'm the Director of Intersections of Gender, which is one of 5 signature areas of research and teaching at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton, Canada. I want to begin today by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral lands and traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples and the lands of the Métis Nation Region 4. Acknowledging territory for me means more than doing just a cursory or a rote statement. Acknowledging territory, I suggest, calls us to make a commitment to learning more about and respecting Indigenous histories and knowledges and traditions, a commitment to studying and understanding the responsibilities of treaties and treaty relations and of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, and a commitment to research, teaching, and governance that will contribute to a wider acknowledgement of ongoing colonial violence and a commitment to real action to end this violence. I know that many of you are joining us today from many other places, and so I invite you to reflect upon your own location and the responsibilities that come with living on and with the histories of the land and the people where you are located. Intersections of Gender in Conversation is a series that we started in April this year as an opportunity for more informal conversations with scholars about and in response to current events as they are unfolding. And through most of the summer, we discussed topics related to COVID. We started with an Intersections of Gender in Conversation on COVID and gender. We talked about racism and masculinity. We talked about frontline healthcare workers and gender-based violence. And you can find these earlier conversations on Facebook and on our webpage. Just look for Intersections of Gender. There you can also find links to the sound and text versions of these events. And we are recording this event today and will make it available both in text, sound, and video form after the event. Today I have with me Dr. Shirley Anne Tate and Dr. Chris Andersen to talk about institutional racism. Let me begin by introducing our 2 speakers today. Dr. Shirley Anne Tate is professor in the Sociology Department at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, where she is a Canada Research Chair Tier 1 designate in Feminism and Intersectionality. She is Honorary Professor, Chair in Critical Studies and Higher Education Transformation at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, as well as Visiting Professor at the Universities of Helsinki and Leeds Beckett University in the UK. Her research and numerous publications concern Black diaspora studies broadly conceived, as well as institutional racism, the body, affect, beauty, race, performativity, and Caribbean decolonial studies, while also paying attention to the intersections of race and gender. And Dr. Chris Andersen is professor and dean in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. His research interests include Aboriginal statistics, urban Indigenous identities, everyday Métis life post-World War II, critical Indigenous studies, and the racialization of indigeneity in Canadian courts. He is the author of 2 books, including with Maggie Walter, Indigenous Statistics, a Quantitative Indigenous Methodology, and Métis, Race Recognition and the Struggle for Indigenous People, published by UBC Press in 2014. And in 2015, he was named to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. So thank you, welcome Shirley, and thank you, Shirley and Chris, for joining me today. It's really great to see you and that you make the time for this. So the format of our conversation today is we have about, I think, 50 minutes for conversation, for a dialogue. And then we will open up for questions from the audience. So if you want to ask some questions, you can post them through the Q&A function, and you can post questions at any time. I will probably have to select a few because my sense is that with this topic, we'll probably run out of time because there's more than 50 minutes to talk about when we talk about institutional racism. So Chris, let me begin with you by turning to you. As the Dean of Native Studies at the UFA, which is the only faculty of Native Studies in Canada and all of North America, I believe, what does institutional racism look like from your perspective? And what do you see as the role and opportunities of a dedicated faculty of Native Studies in combating institutional racism?
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne, for the introduction to have a conversation with folks here today. You had sent the questions out before, and it's a really complicated and complex question that can be answered in a bunch of different ways, which I'm sure that the current participants who are watching right now, depending on your disciplinary background, will kind of answer in ways that make sense to you. I mean, at one level, I could obviously talk about the amount of resources that the Faculty of Native Studies has received over the past 2 generations in comparison to other faculties on campus, because as most of us here probably know, that institutional racism is partly based on an inequitable distribution of various types of resources over generations and the impact that, that this then has. But when I thought about how to answer the question, I started thinking about it in the context of my own work around Indigenous identity and Indigenous identification. And so if Shirley and Suzanne, you don't mind, I'm going to answer the question probably slightly differently than people might expect. And for me, the idea of institutional racism is linked very strongly to the idea of whiteness, linked very strongly to the idea of white supremacy, or as Aileen Morton Robinson, an Indigenous theorist in Australia, refers to it, white possession or white possessiveness. And so from my perspective, one of the things that I find very interesting, especially in the era of the TRC, say over the past 6 or 7 years, is the impact that institutional racism and understandings of what the contours and boundaries of indigeneity are, what that has looked like as different universities have responded to the TRC in the ways that they have. And so from my perspective, one of the things that became very interesting to me over the past 5 or 6 years is to look at the way in which self-identification has become the privileged dynamic of identity formation around indigeneity in the academy. So when you look at universities responding to the TRC and responding to the claims of institutional racism in their locales, what many universities have done is to hire increased numbers of Indigenous faculty and staff at their universities as part of a larger goal, whether explicitly stated or not, to make the university, a more welcoming place for Indigenous faculty, staff, and students. But what's really interesting to me is the manner in which, and I'll get a little bit theoretical here for a second, the manner in which liberalism operates in Canadian universities makes it very difficult for us to move beyond dynamics of individual self-identification as a basis for indigeneity. So in other words, indigeneity is treated as a binary, you either are or you are not, and we don't get into a more productively complicated discussion about what the limitations of seeing it as a binary actually are. And so the way that this has manifested itself has been around many universities hiring Indigenous faculty members who don't have strong connections to community, who didn't grow up with community or extended family, many of whom grew up, for all intents and purposes, in middle-class white families with all of the opportunities and all of the social and cultural capital you get from growing up in white middle-class families, and have kind of, made their way through the university system, become professors, and now have been hired as Indigenous professors in whatever discipline they're in. And I think something similar can be said about the kinds or the backgrounds of Indigenous students who are getting a majority of the awards that are handed out to Indigenous students at universities, especially those that are tied to GPA and other kinds of things that we know are associated with class, that we know are associated with various kinds of privilege. And so from my perspective, this is part and parcel of how universities, when the TRC came in and before, but we're just talking about kind of the TRC era now, universities could have responded to the TRC in one or both of two ways. They could have responded by making it a more welcoming place for Indigenous faculty, staff, and students, and or they could have responded by building stronger relationships with Indigenous communities. And overwhelmingly, universities responded by attempting to remove barriers rather than build relationships. And I think this is what we're seeing kind of over the past 6 or 7 years as a result of that largely tacit or unconscious or pre-reflective decision to do that, which is not to say that universities haven't been building relationships with Indigenous communities. That's certainly the case. But when you look at what the impact of this has been, I see this as an effect, and as Dr. Tate will talk about in a second, also as an affect of what institutional racism looks like and how it's played itself out on campuses at the University of Alberta. Speaking specifically as the Dean of the Faculty of Native Studies, I think one of the things that we do really well, we certainly emphasize it, and we have amazing, amazing, amazing faculty and staff in our faculty. We really think about what it means to, pardon the expression, put your own mask on first, what it actually means to be in a space with other Indigenous scholars or non-Indigenous scholars who have very strong, long-standing ethical working relationships with Indigenous communities. And I think that's one of the things that we are in a position to do more and to do more effectively than most other disciplines on campus, is to have all those different people from different disciplines in one space who have a common goal of upholding Indigenous sovereignty, of helping to build community capacity by beginning with an understanding that we don't have a moratorium on the answers, we don't have a moratorium on what is legitimate knowledge, and learning from communities just as we attempt to engage with them. So,
thank you, Chris. I think that's a really kind of powerful entrance point, and I really appreciate your distinction between what I would call a purely representational politics and the kind of relationally grounded, community-grounded ways of knowledge production within Indigenous studies. I think that's really, really helpful. Thank you. Shirley, I will turn to you now, a slight kind of shift of conversation. I mean, you have written quite extensively about micro-practices of anti-Black and people of color institutional racism in universities and their affects. So can you talk a little bit about what micro-practices of institutional racism are and how they impact particularly Black people of color faculty and students?
Okay. Thanks, Chris. That was really amazing. Thank you so much. And Susanna, thank you for making this conversation possible. I really appreciate the invitation as well. I had to write this down because the question made me also think about why did I do this in a way? And one of the things that I always say is that there comes a point at which you can no longer be silent. You have to say something, you have to do something. So that's part of why I did it. But I think the micro practices of institutional racism and their affects became important to me because of institutional racism's profound deniability. So micro practices such as invalidations. So for example, a white colleague repeating what you just said, and nobody heard you say it, but it's been heard by your white colleague. Students saying to you, when will the lecturer arrive? You know, when will the professor arrive? Things like aggressions as well. All Black people are, oh, but you're so different, Shirley. You're not like that at all. Micro insults as well, being made completely invisible. So for example, I am a really okay person, so I like to say hello to people. That's just normal for me. But you know, you can be in institutions with people and say good morning to them every day and never get a response. That's happened to me as well, repeatedly. Also, you can walk into a room and feel the hostility when people turn to look at you because you're not exactly what they expected to come in as the professor of whatever. all of these sorts of things, which are sometimes called microaggressions, but which I like to call micro practices of institutional racism instead, in a way, impact BPOC scholars, students, and administrators, because racism can be denied and relegated only to what we feel. So it can be made to disappear if it's just us feeling it. For me, it was important to look at racism's affects, to write about them, to look at how we feel our way around organizations, how white supremacy can occupy space so that we pick up on this, we feel it, and know that we do not belong. It took a really long time for me. I turned page. It took a long time for me to really process my own experiences. It took me years, in fact, and those of other BPOC women, and to think about how to theorize that, the pain, for example. How do you theorize the pain? How do you theorize the marginalization? How do you theorize the trauma? How do you theorize the upset, being unable to sleep at night? How do you theorize the migraines that people get from having these sorts of experiences all the time? It was a really important turning point for me in my thinking, talking to other Black women as well, because it meant that I had to look at how structures, processes, practices, strategies, curricula, for example, produce a psychic life of racism in institutions to which a variety of negative effects are attached. For example, shame, contempt, tolerance, all which lead to racism's deniability, but which can be felt. So looking at anti-Black people and people of color racism in terms of affects refuses this deniability, as I keep saying. And that for me was really key, right? So I had to write about it because I don't believe that there's a divide between activism and scholarship. And this reminded me about what Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mahanti said all that time ago about decolonization. For them, decolonization is thinking oneself out of the spaces of domination, but always within the context of a collective or communal process. Decolonization happens through action and reflection, through practice. Decolonization also has psychic and pedagogical dimensions. So for me, writing on micro-practices and racism's affect has both a psychic and pedagogical function. For me, and for others who might read my work, is help me to understand, to reflect on, to transform relations of objectification and dehumanization. And I hope to pass what I know on to others through theorizing from experience. And you know, theorizing from experience is a very old feminist practice, also a very old critical theory practice as well. So that's really why I began to think about micro practices from other people's experiences and my own, to refuse institutional racism's deniability and to make it our problem because we feel it. And it's not meant, you know, nothing's there to stop it from being nebulous. That's it. I hope.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. In some ways, I want to ask a question that we didn't talk about before, because I thought it was really, I mean, you know, thank you for this very powerful contribution. But what for me was also interesting is that you kind of hold on to activism and scholarship as connected. And in some ways, I want to bring Chris back in if you feel like it spontaneously, because is there a triangle between activism, scholarship, and community? Is there, because what I heard in your piece, Chris, was really an emphasis and the lack of the university to actually engage in community relations and community knowledges. Right, and the kind of theory-practice debate has a long and ongoing one. Do you want to speak to that, or?
Sure. Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. One, I get worried when our Indigenous studies graduate students feel like the work that they engage in, as part of the credentialing exercise to get their, their MAs and PhDs and that kind of thing, has to speak to multiple audiences at the same time. So I feel like they put this extra encumbrance on a process that's already incredibly difficult and incredibly emotionally draining to complete, and begin to think that in addition to doing what every other student that doesn't sort of care about the political element has to do on top of that, they have to do all of this other stuff. And so I often tell students to be kind of very careful and very specific about the way that they think about those kinds of things. But the second thing I would say is, I think people within the university, faculty and staff at any university, have variously done a greater or lesser job of connecting with communities in ways that communities find useful. But I think that universities in general have a tendency not to approach communities with humility. And so when you don't approach communities with humility and you think you have all the answers, and if they have answers that you don't, you dismiss them, or if they don't fit into whatever models you have, you dismiss them, it makes it very, very difficult to build trust between yourself and the communities that you're engaged with when you engage with them at all. And so I think from my perspective, at least, whatever the relationship between theory and practice is, and I don't know if this is kind of a cop-out answer to the question, but whatever the relationship between the theory and practice discussion is, there has to be a strong dollop of humility that's involved with that to build the trust that's required to actually get, some type of reciprocal relationship and discussion on both sides. Because scholars, especially who work in communities, you see all the time that what you thought your project was about when you went into community is not what community members are taking from the project, and it's certainly not what's important to them about the project. And so understanding that these are two different power sources that you act as kind of a translator for, and that they act as a translator for, is a really important element of this, I would say. I'm not sure if that answers the question, Suzanne, but.
No, I find that really quite helpful. Thank you, I appreciate that. And I also see in our commentary that one of our audience members says, yes, humility is very much lacking in academia. And I think you really put your finger on that. That's not how academia historically has worked. But let's kind of shift maybe a little bit in the context of the ongoing global protest against anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence. The presidents of several Canadian universities, including our former president, Dr. David Turpin, have issued statements of solidarity with Black Lives Matter in particular. And our new president, Dr. Bill Flanagan, has spoken of the important role that universities play in combating racism. So, moving on from solidarity statements, what would you like to see? What needs to happen after the solidarity statements in order for universities to move to anti-racist action, right? I mean, statements, I began in some ways this, we do a statement of territory acknowledgement, but I think is really important. But of course, there are many critiques that is not really leading to action. Similarly, we have important solidarity statements, and I appreciate them. But what action do universities need to take, in your view, to move beyond solidarity statements? Shirley, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I can start first. I was waiting for Chris to start, but I can start first.
You spoke last, so that's why I'm moving back to you.
I know, that's what I thought. I think, first of all, universities have to accept that racism is an issue, racism is a problem, because too often that's not even acknowledged at all as an issue within them. So for me, EDI fails for that reason, actually, just doesn't work. So maybe there has to be a whole review of EDI too. But I want to speak, I think, more centrally to, the changes that will be needed in institutional culture, some of them, because I don't know all of them, of course, but I can share some that I've been thinking about. Because I think that institutional culture is where we get racism really embedded and resistant to change. That's what I would say. So what needs to happen to enable anti-racist action? has got to be undertaken by both, by everyone, actually, by everyone. And it has to relate again to what I said earlier about psychic and pedagogical decolonization as well, right? So the first thing I think that we all have to do, however we locate ourselves, is to unsuitor from whiteness and white privilege. That for me is something that I'm still trying to work on, but I think to say it is already quite significant, and to say it quite loudly, because, you know, white privilege within institutions is never really acknowledged, never really thought about. And the whiteness, the white supremacy that is within institutions also is rarely voiced. Chris said it, which was great. Then students that I know in different countries constantly talk about decolonizing the curriculum and what counts as knowledge. And that's something that's not new. It's been with us for quite some time. I also think it's really important to make respectful BIPOC alliances to build an anti-racist collective within universities. For me, that's really important. I can't see anything happening without collective action, without collective BIPOC alliances. I think it's important to say that. I think also that white colleagues must acknowledge the problem. They should also stop being complicit, and they should take action to address racism within their own psyches and within institutions. They also need to recognize that anti-racism will not happen through training. I see Donald Trump this week throughout all the training in the United States saying people shouldn't do any training anymore. But though it was wrong there, I think there's a particular training that certainly inhabits UK academic life. I don't know about Canada because, you know, I'm kind of new. I don't know that much about Canada really. But in the UK, it's called unconscious bias training. So you can see already that there's a problem thinking that bias is unconscious and you can train people out of it. That simply does not work. It's been shown not to work for a really long time. Though what we should replace it with, I don't know. But I think what we should say is that this training doesn't work because it just does this kind of absolution. You can't help it. You can't help it. This is just how things are. As long as you recognize that you can't help it, you're an okay person. And I think for me, what's really always been important, and I know that this is a hard one too, especially for people, for us who are like situated in positions that we don't think are powerful in terms of institutional status. But I think it's really important for us all to call out racism wherever and whenever we see it occurring. But we should also feel that we can be supported to act as well, rather than just being that one sole voice who does do it and then, you know, gets reprimanded in one way or another, and then there's nobody behind you to support. So for me, it's about building BIPOC alliances really in order to build an anti-racist collective. But also we need action on white supremacy, and we need it to be recognized as a problem rather than just a little pet project that Shirley has, for example. That's it.
Thanks, Shirley. Chris, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I would say, I won't state this as articulately as Shirley did, but I think, again, statements are fine, although I find that universities often kind of lick a finger and stick it up in the air to see what other universities are doing before they make decisions about writing statements. I think concrete commitments are useful to put into statements. So if you're going to do a statement of solidarity, which by the way, no one asked you to do, what will you commit to a year from now? What will you commit to 5 years from now? I think that's useful. I think a large part of this, unfortunately, comes down to figuring out, often retrospectively, what white people are going to care about, or what non-BIPOC people are going to care about. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the the next question. So in thinking about the way that Shirley framed this, a lot of this comes down to non-Indigenous people, from our perspective, being willing to sit with discomfort, being willing to feel uncomfortable about something and kind of staying in that pocket. And I go back to this absolutely brilliant article that Dr. Fiona Nicol wrote probably almost 20 years ago now, called something like, "Are You Calling Me Racist?" And it was about teaching Indigenous sovereignty as a white woman. And she has this discussion in there about how we seem to get caught in these cycles where we want to make people feel guilt and shame. I have no interest in making people feel any more guilt or shame than I have to, because guilt and shame are emotions of luxury, and people can use them and use their privilege to turn away. Men have been doing this for millennia. I'm interested in getting people to think in terms of what public responsibility actually looks like. So how can we turn that outward into a sense of public responsibility? And so I appreciate when universities take the time to make a decision to write a statement of solidarity, but it's a comma, it's not a period. And far too often it's treated as a period.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, I want to kind of thank you. There's lots to think about. I want to kind of dig in a little bit more, maybe, for a question that seems to also coming up in the Q&A right now, which is, so what do we do with that? My impression is that lots of disciplinary knowledges are so deeply steeped in whiteness that what even gets recognized as knowledge is framed certainly by non-Indigenous epistemologies, but also by assumptions, some fields call it neutrality or objectivity, or people make kind of comments like, oh, what you're doing is just research rather than research, right? Because it kind of focuses on the experiences of Black and Indigenous students, faculty, and so on. So, what about the kind of, do you see that as a problem, that part of what I think somebody in the Q&A asked, how foundations of our institutions and foundational knowledges are actually deeply steeped in whiteness? That seems to be, a huge challenge of how to undo that. Is that anything that you want to speak to?
Do you want to go first, Chris?
Well, I'm not sure I have anything particularly smart to say about this, except maybe to say, yes. Obviously it is. I have to admit, I do get a chuckle when people tell me that the university is a colonial institution. I've been here for 24 years. Like, I don't know that the university is a colonial institution. But whiteness is pretty nearly a total system. And so it becomes an interesting exercise about what things people will focus on as being kind of foundational to whiteness, yet don't think about all the other ways that we engage in a system of whiteness on a daily basis, even BIPOC people, without even thinking about it. So at one level, it's important to kind of think about how to build some transparency into this, and how to get people to be reflective and think about how pervasive and how omnipresent whiteness actually is. Because otherwise what ends up happening is we get into these discussions where someone picks a particular pet element of whiteness and wants to stamp that element out, while everything else is still kind of running full steam ahead. So yeah, I agree with the sentiment, but it is definitely extremely difficult to think outside of.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Chris. I really share that position as well. To add to that, I think for me, one of the things that I've always wondered, from being in the UK for like many decades, and going to university there and doing all of my post-secondary education there, I always wondered why there was nothing from Black people, written by Black people in the curriculum. And I think that we have Black students now in the 21st century who still think that. Mm-hmm. So for me, that is a real indictment of a system which continues to refuse Black thought, refuse, Black academic thought, which, Black people have written on so many different things.
Yeah.
Not hard to find, but people continue to refuse it. Colleagues continue to refuse it. I've had colleagues say to me very disastrous things in the UK, like, no theory ever came out of the Caribbean. Now, for somebody to say that already shows you the coloniality in which their own learning is steeped. So for me, I find it totally objectionable that I, myself, have got to make this the focus. I love it, by the way. I have to make this the focus of my work to ensure that some students who do courses with me actually read things written by Black people about Black people, right? And, what irks me more than anything else is that when I leave, that teaching stops, because it's supposed to be embedded in me because I'm a Black woman. So, it's very particularistic. So only Shirley can do that. Only Shirley is interested in that. And the research doesn't matter because it's always just about one group of people. It's not generalizable like the whole of white thought is.
Right.
So for me, those are little pet peeves of mine. And I just want to remind people of something that happened this week. I think it was this week. It's been a long week, but I think it was this week in the United States, when the president of the United States said, we have to get rid of critical race studies from universities because it's unpatriotic. Interesting choice of what he needs to get rid of, would you not say? I would say that. Why not get rid of some other stuff? And look how long it took to get Black studies into American universities, right? And look at the fight back that there's also been against it there. Still in the UK, for example, there's only one university in the UK that's got a Black studies program within it, one.
Yep.
So why is that? Are Black people incapable of thought that is good theory, of thought that amounts to knowledge, right? That is the incredible way in which racism works, this incredible erasure that still continues through what we teach our students. So, I mean, one of the things that I always find interesting about students also, and this is not students' fault, it's the fault of the system, is that I show pictures of my theories sometimes, and they're like, oh, this is the UK. Oh, you didn't know they were Black. Stuart Hall is Black. Yeah, Stuart Hall is Black and Stuart Hall is Jamaican. Yeah, they don't know things like that. Angela Davis, oh, she's Black too. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? All thought seems to be in people's mind that it all comes from white people, especially if you have a name which could be that of a white person. That's all I want to say, because I'm getting a bit impassioned.
Can I add to that maybe? Because
please do. Yes.
Has really has spurred my thought on this. One of the things that we argue is different about Indigenous studies is that we're the exact opposite of most disciplines, in the sense that most disciplines take things that seem really complex and they break them down into more easily digestible chunks for learning. We often find ourselves doing the opposite. We take things that seem like they're really simple and break them down into more complex chunks to make them understandable. And so I think part of the role that whiteness plays is kind of tied into the idea that we know what indigeneity is, we know what the limits of indigeneity is, and it's an oversimplification of the kind of the full complexity of what indigeneity is or what indigeneities are. And you don't have to read too much Stuart Hall or Edward Said to understand the role that colonialism plays in simplifying and oversimplifying our understandings of people who are not white. And so I think that's one of the things that Indigenous studies strives to do, is to demonstrate that complexity and to get outside of those binary boundaries.
Yes. Thank you. And as we are talking, what comes to my mind is, I don't know if you've seen that, but I think it's the University of Chicago, the English department actually put out a statement of solidarity that was not just a statement of solidarity, but they basically said that Black literature, the traditions of Black literature, are part of the canon, and they expect that every faculty member in the English department is capable of teaching this Black canon, and that it needs to be part of every course. And I think this year they made a commitment to only accept PhD students who bring interest in Black studies to their, I think, very prestigious program. So that to me seems actually like a real commitment, right? Is to say, yes, we're not, as my students always say, yeah, every class has one class on Black or Indigenous thought, and it's usually the last class at the end of the course, right? And it often gets cut. So I think that is an example where a department actually has made a very clear commitment to saying this is part of, if you're an English professor, you need to be able to teach and understand that Black literature is part of the canon. I thought that was quite kind of interesting.
It is, but let me just ask
please.
one thing. I'll be quick because I know we don't have much time. Why did it take so long?
Yeah.
Why did it take until BLM for that to happen?
Yeah. No.
Just to say.
No, thank you, Shirley. We have so. I mean, it's the kind of last question that we kind of thought about we would talk about is, what are your hopes and dreams for addressing institutional racism? It feels a bit like, I don't know what I think about this question. I feel like I need to nervously giggle at this question. But do you want to speak to that a bit?
Well, I'll give a facetious answer. If a Black man getting murdered in Minnesota can change the name of the Edmonton Eskimos football team here, then surely anything is possible. But more seriously, I don't know whether it's possible, and I wish I was a more optimistic person, but my general kind of disposition is not. But that doesn't matter. That's not my role. Isn't to assure a particular kind of outcome. My role, especially now that I'm a dean, is to support other people and to make sure that they are working and kind of living lives that they think moves them toward that goal. And there's a great vignette from one of the critical race theory books. I want to say it's one of Derek Bell's books, although if anyone remembers the actual vignette, please correct me, where he's talking about, he's walking along with an older Black female activist, and he's totally despondent over a court case that they've just lost. And he's sort of complaining, and he looks over at the woman that he's walking with, and he says, why are you not affected by this? Or why is this not hitting you as hard as it's hitting me? And she said, well, no, it's hitting me quite hard. He said, so why aren't you more kind of sad or despondent? And she kind of shrugs and she says, because I lives to torment white people. So the whole idea is we're not going to let non-Indigenous people get away with saying, we're not going to let Indigenous people get away with saying that they have been saying their whole career because nobody called them on it. At a certain point, I don't give a if we ever get to whatever the promised land is, we're going to make people uncomfortable on the way. Pardon my phrasing.
Thank you, Chris. Shirley.
I had just one sentence written here. And I share Chris's point of view about the struggle, because the struggle is real. It is real, and it certainly won't go away in my lifetime, and probably not the lifetime of people who are like just born today, for example. But if I would have like one hope, it would be that one day all of my writing will be obsolete. That would be my one hope, I think. Really.
I think that is in some ways it's a very fitting, thank you, and powerful last sentence. I wish that in some ways we won't have these conversations at some point, but I think till we are at that point, we need many, many more conversations. And I really hear you both kind of very clearly articulate that this is also a responsibility of white people, people who look like me, to take this on and to work for institutional change. We have a bit of, thank you. So I know this is a difficult topic, and I know that it's also, I think, Shirley, you have also written about it. There is the affective labor of talking about this, of doing this work for Black and Indigenous faculty member and students increasingly. I think we must not forget that our students are doing an enormous work. They're also the recipients of the refusal to address racism, microaggressions, practices of micro practices of racism that you have spoken about. It's our students who actually, really also bear the brunt of that. And so part of me always hopes that we actually make it, our white faculty like myself, to make it part of our, the care that we express for our students to actually do better. So I think there's, certainly many more conversations to be had. I'm looking through the questions from the audience. We have the Q&A open, and I'm kind of looking through them right now and see what's coming up there. So one of the questions that I saw earlier was that in certain fields, it's kind of considered inappropriate to even look at people's identities, right? So I think people often talk about STEM fields that you can't even speak about whether people are Black or Indigenous. I mean, that seems to be a problem particularly when we talk about citational practices, right? That in some ways we have touched upon. So what are we going to do with that? Whereas the unwillingness of certain disciplines to even acknowledge that people's social position matters.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I don't know the disciplinary context of that, but speaking from an Indigenous studies context, people will often think or talk about what rights accrue from being connected to a particular identity, and you have people like Kim Tallbear, people like Jill Bilfler, people like Jessica Kolopenik, absolutely brilliant scholars in their own rights, who are asking us what are the responsibilities that accrue from those connections. And for me, one of those responsibilities is self-identifying and having a clear narrative and clear articulation of not only who you claim, but who claims you. And I make no bones about that. And it can be scary for people who didn't grow up with community or with extended family, because you don't get to pick where your parents live. But if you're going to connect to that identification, if that's going to become your kind of situated self-understanding, then it behooves you, and it's your responsibility to do the work to connect to those who you are claiming. Not everyone agrees with my take on this, and so Shirley, you can feel free to disagree, but I feel quite strongly about that.
No, I completely agree with you. I can't see how I'm going to separate myself out into nice chunks so that the people who think the way of that question will feel comfortable. And I have to say, people who think you can separate yourself out in nice chunks are people speaking from a position of privilege, really. Their identity might matter to them, so other people shouldn't either. Well, no, other people's do. So that's it.
Right. So do I also hear a call then for people to identify, even if it is against their tradition or disciplinary practices? And what does that mean for, what is always interesting to me, and I don't know if this is relevant here, but what is also always interesting to me is that my Indigenous colleagues acknowledge their kinship, right? Who their people are, what nations they come from. And it's not a practice that white folks engage in. So is that a useful practice for us to kind of unsettle whiteness by actually marking it initially? Is that a... I don't know if that's a...
Well, no, I mean, I learned a lot from colleagues in the SCIP colloquium. So I want to thank people who organized that. It reminds me of what I lost in moving from Jamaica to the UK, and that was to name my lineage. Because in Jamaica, people always ask you, where are you from and who's your father and your mother, right? Oh, who are your grandparents, something like that. So you always have to name yourself in that kind of way. And like for me, I relearned that through SCIP, and that's an invaluable thing for me. But on the other hand as well, one of the things that I think is important is for us to claim our identifications rather than to live through other people's ascriptions of us as this or that. That to me is really important, because people will say, I am that thing, whatever it is they have in mind that a Black woman should be. It's got nothing to do with me whatsoever. So for me, it's important to say who I am. And not just me, I think in kind of activist politics, it's important to say who you are, right? For example, what was more powerful for me as an older Black woman than watching BLM on TV, where people are saying, say her name, Breonna Taylor, say his name, George Floyd. What is more important than that person's name? Your name contains a lot about who you are and where you place yourself and where your community places you too. So, I don't see how you can say your identity doesn't matter. I'm sorry.
And maybe we'll add one proviso to my earlier comment. It's quite easy for me, someone who is a relatively large, white-coated, cisgendered, hetero male, to talk about kind of claiming space or not. People should have a conversation with themselves about whether it's actually safe to do it, because of course not everyone has the same configuration of subject vectors that allow them to do that. So I am quite cognizant of that as well.
Right. So you would actually say it also is context specific, in which context people can safely identify and in which context they simply can't.
Yeah.
And and I think, I hear quite clearly that, for example, I hear this from colleagues, particularly in STEM fields. I would say when I speak to people across the university that the pressure there is particularly strong because of a strong relationship to what is objectivity. And I think in some ways in social science and humanities, we have a bit of a longer history of people actually acknowledging their positionality of where their knowledge is coming from, what are the limits of their knowledge are. Though clearly I'm not arguing in any form or fashion that isn't written through with ongoing white privilege and unacknowledged. I'm not saying that, but in some ways maybe we have a tradition there on which one theoretically at least can build, if there's a willingness to actually to have these conversations. I'm looking at the questions here. Trying to see what kind of last question we can have here. So I think there's one question that is quite specific. Chris, I don't know if you see this too. So there's a question around you've kind of talked about your concern about the binary characterization of indigeneity. And this is a question about hiring processes. And so here's the question is, how do we get around the binary characterization of indigeneity in hiring processes, given biases in what is considered knowledge within academia, recognition of the validity of the process of gaining knowledge through different systems, and the related issue of what is recognized as training? This also, the question asked is related to issues of humility and identifying what are valid and important questions to communities worthy of academic research within our institutions. Do you want to expand a bit more on the kind of how this your concern with the binary works in hiring processes?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be able to speak to how the binary works in units outside of ours, because I don't really know. But I would say, sorry, are you talking about binaries of Indigenous identification or binaries of Indigenous knowledge?
I think it seems to be an identification here. I think it goes back to.
I mean, I would. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you, Suzanne.
That's my understanding of the question, that it goes back to binaries of hiring process, so that seems to refer to identification.
Yeah, I mean, the issue here is that when people make claims to self-identification, there's nothing wrong with that. Previous to that was the Indian Act, in which people were, legally stuck into particular categories regardless of how they self-identified. I have absolutely nothing against self-identification. It's a hallmark, in the modern age of how we identify. My issue is it's not the only or even the most important dynamic when it comes to identity making. And so from my perspective, if someone were coming to apply for a job in the Faculty of Native Studies and they self-identified as something, we would immediately ask them where they're from. And in fact, I don't think there are too many people that would apply to the faculty who weren't already pretty comfortable with being able to narrate that, whether or not they grew up in community, growing up at all. This, again, you don't get to pick where your parents live. So this isn't an essentialist argument about these people are really Indigenous and these are not. These are about what your ethical commitments are when you're making those decisions about how to identify. I would say that the hiring processes at the University of Alberta, because we're such a decentralized university, are a good deal less binary than people probably tend to think about, because different disciplines have different ways of understanding people's particular claims. So I don't know if it's as binary as the question could conceivably be read, but one of the major things for me would be to ask kind of what is the community or even extended family connection there.
Right. Thank you so much. We are coming to the end of our time. I feel like we just kind of began a conversation as always, or, I know the conversation has been going on for a very long time, but I feel like in this, today in our event, we just had a beginning of a public conversation about it. I really, really appreciate your time, your insight, your expertise. As always, I've learned a lot. And in some ways, I hope that we will have this conversation in many different places at the university and move to action from our, strategic commitments in the EDI plan that we have in the university and from our the declarations of solidarity. But that, yes, that we really move on to many, many more conversations in different contexts. I want to say thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time, and yes, and thank you to the audience for tuning in today. This conversation will be available through our webpage, Intersections of Gender, and YouTube in both video, text format, and audio file. And I also want to thank, of course, Dr. Shirley Anne Tate and Dr. Chris Andersen, as well as Rachel Sukivsky, who helped us through the technology here today and did a lot of background work to make this conversation possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.